Are you actually building out the whole interior offsite as well? So that's simultaneous, or is that once it's in place? So I'd love to dive into the shipping containers because it's interesting. In 2000, like probably 9, when I was in undergrad, I did a project on shipping containers. And I remember it was just so new and kind of like exciting at that point. And I can imagine, like you said, not only like the permitting, but there had to have been a lot of, and I think even maybe still a lot of questions of, can this be done? Is it worth it? Can we actually save money here? So we can dive into a lot more of that, but I'd love to hear kind of that process of using shipping containers, maybe any challenges that came with that. Maybe in the long run, would it have been easier to not use shipping containers?
It's a great question. It's funny because even with, with Courtyard, right, as our thesis project, we didn't want to do containers to begin with, which was sort of funny. We were like, you know what, shipping containers have been done. This is a thesis. We're so innovative and whatever. Like we're going to come up with a new cool thing, which we didn't. And we tried, but ultimately we were pushed and driven back to the containers because they just made a lot of sense for this type of project. For a project that's going to be there for 2, 4, 5, 10 years, like Courtyard was, containers just made a lot of sense. We were doing single wide things. It was an economical way for us to do it. You don't save a huge amount of money. Like, it might say online and, people think they build a house for $20,000. That's not accurate. But the container made sense for us for that project. For some projects that we do nowadays, it doesn't make sense. It really depends on where it's located. Can you ship containers there to begin with? Is it in a rural area where you're going to have problems getting up a hill? Is there power lines in the way if you're trying to crane them off the back of a truck? All that sort of stuff comes into play where the modular really makes sense. We ended up sticking with modular for that project. That was really a big flag in the ground, which then sort of spurred our whole architecture firm. And we've done shipping container projects across the country since. And for some projects it makes sense and some it doesn't. Sometimes people just want a container project because it's a cool factor. Some people want it because it's it's sustainable type of, you're using a recycled material obviously with the container. There's a surplus of shipping containers in the United States and you do get them relatively inexpensive for what they are, but at the end of the day that's what a shipping container is a container built for shipping. It's not built to be a housing. So when you do start modifying them and using them for a project, you do have to structurally reinforce them, all that sort of good stuff. And at the end of the day, it's just like, if you're doing a regular traditional build, you've still got to put in the same insulation, you've got to put in the same studs, the same toilets, the same floor, you've still got to put a foundation and bring utilities to it and all that sort of good stuff. And that's the big cost of the project. Does it save you a lot of money? Not really. Where we see it is saving is time, because you can build the units off site while you're simultaneously doing the foundation work and bringing utilities and all that sort of good stuff that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do if it's a traditional build where you're doing utilities and foundation first and then going up. So that's probably the biggest savings.
Yeah, that was one of my biggest questions because, you still have the building science side of it where you have to make sure that it's insulated. So in my mind, you essentially have a shell. So maybe you have like an exterior finish, then you still use the same 2x4s or whatever you need, which then maybe encloses it even more. You still need to run all the proper things. So when I think of it, I kind of think of it like that. Like, is it really actually just a facade where you're now just building a typical standard structure within it in a way?
Sure. I mean, that is correct. It is ultimately a facade. And that's what I sort of tell people mostly is like, if they're wanting to use a shipping container, what's the reason? If you're doing it to save money, don't let that be your driving factor, because they are also restrictive. Shipping containers come in very limited sizes. It's typically an 8-foot wide by either 20-foot long or 40-foot long, 9.5-foot tall. We use the high cubes, which is 9.5-foot tall. We put them together, we stack them next to each other, we can open them up, all that sort of stuff to make them wide, put double wides, triple wides, whatever it is. You can stack them on top of each other, remove floor and the roofing and really open them up. But the more you start opening them up, the more expensive putting back into them. So it is a balancing act. And again, you've got to understand why you want to use containers and if it really makes sense per the project. We love using them. We think they're a great building block essentially to be starting with a project. But for us, if a project doesn't make sense with containers, we're very clear about that and we know whether to cut it off there and do it as a traditional build versus using containers. So yeah.
There's certain parts of the country where it might make more sense to do a container versus other parts. I know you mentioned kind of topography, but what about actually regions?
I wouldn't say there's places where it makes more sense to use a shipping container over others, to be honest with you. There's certainly places in the country where it's easier to permit a shipping container project. There's certainly places where, so typically for California, for example, since we're based in Cali, it's what we do is like San Diego, if you look at the building code, actually does not allow a shipping container building, plain and simple. They're very strict about that. But what they do allow is commercial modular units or residential modular units that are approved through the state of California. So when we do a project in an area or a city or a state that doesn't allow shipping container modular units, we just classify them as state approved modular units. And we've never had a problem with the city with that. It essentially takes the liability off the city. They don't have to inspect the units, and they're just seen as, again, like you had mentioned earlier, the shipping container ultimately is just a facade of that modular unit.
As you mentioned, if you're building off-site essentially, and then on-site you're doing, the foundation, whatever utilities in the foundation, are you actually building out the whole interior off-site as well? So that's simultaneous, or is that once it's in place?
So typically we'll build it all probably 95% complete off-site. We're doing one right now we talked about earlier in Waco, Texas. That one's a little bit different. That's all being built on-site, but that's sort of a unique situation in itself. But typically we'll build them 95% complete off-site while we're doing all foundations and utilities often take a while. You got to bring in power and all that sort of good stuff. So if we have the time to do it off-site, we do. And then we bring them on if the shipping containers are, double wides, if there's, we're opening them up and whatnot. There's the finishings and sealing them together and all that sort of stuff on site and waterproofing. But otherwise, yeah.
Are there any special considerations that you have to take for like the detailing when you're doing it? Like you mentioned waterproofing, which is fairly typical when we're designing like our wall systems and our roof systems. Does that constraint add any extra details that are needed?
It does. Typically what I'll tell people if they're wanting to do a container project and if they reach out to us is whether you use us or someone else, use someone who use an architect, use an engineer, use a builder if you can, who has done a shipping container project in the past or who have that expertise, because it's not rocket science, but there is a lot of nuances that come with using a repurposed metal box. And we've learned all these things over the years that we can streamline it, but we've seen it too many times where clients have just hired an architect or engineer and all the above who have said, yeah, we can do this for you. It's no big deal. We'll figure it out. And they ultimately end up figuring it out on their dollar, on the client's dollar, and it ends up costing a lot more. And we've had to come in and have fixed buildings and have, try to save projects that were done incorrectly. And sometimes we've seen them where it's not salvageable, and it's a really unfortunate, but it's a loss, and it's a loss to the client.
Wow. Yeah, and that would not be ideal. Is it like because I know that, you drive up the 5 and you see all the shipping containers in Long Beach area and stuff. Is there just there's certain areas where there's a ton just sitting there, and so it's pretty easy to actually obtain them? Yeah,
so Port of Long Beach is a big one, but there are ports obviously across the country. But what ends up happening is, typically their shipping containers are built in China. They're shipped over, and they're shipping a lot more stuff into America than what we are shipping back to China, right? So it ends up actually being more economical and cheaper for the company over in China to actually build a brand new container than it is to ship back an empty one. And that's why we end up with a bunch of them over here.
Yeah, and I mean that, and a sustainability aspect of that is huge, because otherwise they're just sitting there taking up space, again, when you drive by the port, you can see just crazy amount of shipping containers.